Testing the Moral Status of Artificial Beings, Part 3, The Presumption of Status. One thing that seems reasonable, perhaps, is to adopt a presumption of status as a principle. This is analogous to the presumption of innocence in the U.S. legal system. In the U.S. legal system, in theory at least, the burden of proof is supposed to rest on the prosecution, and they must make their case against the defendant, at least in criminal cases. The moral justification is that it is better that a guilty person be set free than an innocent person be wrongly punished. And again, this is theory. What occurs in practice can be quite different. So one sort of reasonable assumption would be this presumption of status, making use of that. A second one, which is more controversial, is what's known as the precautionary principle. And what makes it rather controversial is that it's used in the moral debates about abortion, which of course is very controversial. In the context of abortion, it works like this. Despite the uncertainty of the moral status of a fetus, one would contend that it is preferable to err on the side of caution and treat it as if it had the status of a person. And so a known person should endure some negative consequences to avoid killing what might be a person. And that's the position that people who adopt the precautionary principle as an anti-abortion argument use. And this, of course, could also be applied to the case of artificial beings. So, when it comes to applying a presumption of status to artificial beings, the justification would be this, that it's morally preferable to err on the side of treating a being better than its status justifies, rather than to treat it worse. And there are three main arguments for this presumption of status. First, the utilitarian argument. Second, the probability argument. And third, the Ersatz argument. So let us begin with the utilitarian argument. Here's how the argument goes. In utilitarianism, to give some context, a moral theory most famously developed by our good dead friend John Stuart Mill, in the idea that an action is right to the degree that it tends to promote happiness for the morally relevant beings, and wrong to the degree that it tends to promote the opposite, namely unhappiness. And there are many versions of utilitarianism, but that's kind of the classic. So here's how the utilitarian argument could go. There should be a presumption of status, because erring on the side of the higher status would tend to avoid more harm than it would create. To use a simple example, suppose in the near future you're working with a human-like android, and you don't know if they really have thoughts and feelings. But you should be as polite to it as you would be to a human, because if you are, if you think it doesn't have status and you're wrong, then it'd be kind of insulting. And if you think it does have status and you're wrong, well, no time lost. You just say hello. And of course, there are people who aren't, mad, who sometimes thank, things they know don't have feelings, like they might thank their car or bike or, toaster or something. Second example. Suppose fairly sophisticated artificial pets become a thing. And suppose a family gets like an artificial dog, and then eventually they get tired of it, but it's still, still working. Now, they don't know for sure if it actually has any feelings, but why not put it up for adoption, essentially give it away to someone, hopefully a good home, rather than simply just tossing it in the trash? Because if they think it has no status and it does feel, they're doing something horrible to it, just like throwing a real dog into a dumpster. If it doesn't have any status and they're nice to it, well, no loss. They were nice to an artificial being that can't feel anything. They spent a little time being nice. Now, an obvious objection would be this, that if we take a presumption of status, this could do more harm than good. How so? What would be an example? Well, imagine a case where, there's suppose, go back to the office where you work with Andy the android, and you're not sure if Andy really thinks or feels, but whenever you go in, and Andy's there, you say, hey, good morning, how was your day? And you treat Andy like you treat a human. But suppose, your workplace catches on fire and, everything's collapsing, and the firefighters must choose between saving you and saving Andy. And, the fire would destroy Andy. He's not fireproof. It would destroy him. So if we go with the presumption of status, then it'd be, 50-50, whether the firefighter saves you or the android. And if the android is just a machine, it has no feelings and intelligence, then essentially they would have let you die to save saving the printer in the office. So there could be cases where the presumption of status, could lead to greater harm. So how can one reply to this? Well, the obvious reply would be that the presumption does more good than harm. So although one must acknowledge there could be specific cases where the presumption of status does create more harm than good. We could allow that because it's probably true. But the general impact of the principle will be positive. Again, going back to the analogy of the presumption of innocence. The general principle, should be accepted because we believe, for good reasons, that it is better to not punish the innocent than it is to, it's better to have a system in which the guilty sometimes go unpunished. It's better than one in which the innocent are punished more. It's not a perfect principle, and there are, countries and legal systems that don't adopt it, but it's not a stupid system, even though we allow that there are cases where, yes, the guilty do go free, for sure, but we believe that it's better that we don't harm innocent people. So we could say the same thing would apply to presumption of status, that yes, there'll be cases where bad things happen, but in general it'd be better than the alternative. Another reply is to go context relative. So the presumption of status could be relative to the context. So if we get a conflict between a being with established status and a being of merely presumed status, then the being with established status should be given moral priority. So going back to the fire example, suppose you and Andy are trapped in the burning workplace, the firefighter comes in, they know you're a person, well, they might not know because of the problem with their minds, etc., but they're pretty sure you're a person. In the case of Andy, they're like, well, Andy's an android, so maybe he's not a person. He could be doing all this stuff and not really thinking or feeling. So more of a problem there. And so what they should do in that case is save you, because as a human being, it's much more certain, much more likely that you definitely have status than the android. To use an analogy to other situations, there are cases where we have seeming knowledge but also doubt. So imagine you pull out into the road and you're driving, and a car comes around the corner right towards you, and you have a choice between going head on to, say, a van full of kids coming back from soccer practice, or swerving and hitting a parked car. Now, there may be people in the parked car, maybe full of kids too. You don't know, but the car in front of you has got kids in it, and so the presumption would be to go with what you believe will do the least harm. So in those cases, you could be wrong, but you generally go with what you know, or more accurately, what seems to be true. Second, presumption of status, probability. So if we go with probability, we can see it as analogous to assessing a risk. To use a concrete and terrifying example, imagine someone hears a noise in their bathroom, and they believe it's an intruder, and they just shoot through the door. Now they're taking a gamble of probability, namely, it may be an intruder, or it may be, their girlfriend, boyfriend, member of the family pet, or just a random noise. And so what we have to work out is probability. So before just shooting through a door, morally one should consider what is on the other side. So in acting towards an artificial being, the probability that it has moral status needs to be considered. So the moral risk of acting in a harmful way towards an artificial being would increase according to the likelihood that being has a moral status. So for example, suppose you're working in a nuclear power plant like Homer Simpson, and you're working with Andy the android. Now, the more likely it is that Andy is also a person. Suppose you've worked with Andy for years, you interact with Andy quite a bit. Andy talks and has stories and discussions about what he dislikes and likes. And so the more likely it is that he has moral status, then the more likely it is, the more probable it is that we should assign Andy this moral status. So you may be thinking, well, how could we possibly do this? How could we estimate? Well, a practical estimate is already possible. We already do this with natural beings. We don't know for sure that animals or even other people, going back to the problem of their mind, have thoughts and feelings, etc. But we do an estimate based on their behavior. So most of us tend to think that dogs, feel and have moral status. And then when it comes to things like ants and roaches and caterpillars, far less so. So for artificial beings, the possibility they possess their apparent status warrants treating them in accord with that status. It's it's gambling in a sense, with a lot at stake. And of course, potential problem, objection. There can be cases where artificial and natural beings come into conflict. Let's go back to our nuclear power plant where you work with Andy. Imagine there's an accident and, someone's got to go down and say, shut down the core, to use a movie terminology. But whoever does that is going to get, irradiated and, die. And also, even though Andy's kind of shielded, the radiation is going to be so intense that it'll wipe out, basically effectively destroy him. So one way to reply to this problem of conflict is to do a straightforward risk calculation that the android should be sent. Why? Well, sending the human would yield a certainty that a being with human status would die, namely a human. Sending the android means it is only likely that a being with human status will be destroyed. So based on probability, a calculation of what is the probability a human's going to die, a human status being will die, then sending the human is the worst choice based on probability. We could do the same exact calculation with two human beings. Suppose instead of working with Andy the android, you work with Andy. And suppose Andy suppose you've been accumulating radiation and you look at your badges and for sure you'll die. You're dead. You'll just die. And Andy, he's much more likely to survive. He has taken less radiation. And so when you're making the choice, send someone who's certainly going to die and sending someone who is only probably going to die, then even though it's a brutal calculation, then the rational thing to do would be to send someone who's not certain to die. And so the risk calculation is analogous. You're essentially making a decision, who do we send, based on the probability that a human status being will die. So in the case of the android, we don't know for sure that it is human status. In the case of two humans, it's a question of we don't know for sure that one of the humans is going to die from the radiation. Now, one objection to this approach is the second-class status objection, because this approach condemns artificial beings to second-class moral status due to epistemic concerns about their actual status, namely that since we don't know for sure, they'll always be locked into second-class status. Now, the problem is, of course, is that humans have historically and currently routinely treated other humans as second class or worse, and this always turns out horribly. So avoiding making the same horrific moral mistakes again by deciding that it's better to err on the side of a higher moral status, than intuitions might indicate, it seems to be the right thing to do. Although people, of course, will argue against this because, again, for the objections raised, concerns about, human superiority, which should sound familiar when we hear humans talking about their superiority over other humans. Third, the presumption of status, the Ersatz option. So Ersatz here means not real, but also not fake. It's not a deception. So the approach here is this. We can accept that while some artificial beings probably lack status, they should still be granted an Ersatz status. This argument is a repurposed version of Kant's argument for treating animals well. Here's how Kant's argument goes. So Kant, in his categorical imperative stuff, bases moral status on rationality and denies that animals are rational. For Kant, animals lack moral status. They are, in his words, objects of the inclination. Even though they can feel stuff, they are but things. They're not people. Because of this, for Kant, we have no direct duties to these animals. But, to his credit, I suppose, he endeavors to sneak in indirect duties to animals. And here's how it would work. If a rational being doing something would create a moral obligation to that being, then an animal doing the same type of thing would create an Ersatz moral obligation. And again, Ersatz here means, not the real thing, but again, it's not a deception, it's not a deceit, there's no malice there. For example, if a person had a dog that can, accompany them throughout their life, protected them, etc., and their dog grew old, and they decided to just, toss the dog, just kill the dog, not putting the animal to sleep mercifully at the end of a life when it's suffering terribly, but just like, I don't want to bother take caring it, just kill the dog. It would be analogous to having, like a parent who took care of one their whole life and they get kind of old, saying, I don't want to spend time taking care of, pups or mom, just, take them out back and kill them. And of course that would be horrible, and treating the dog the same way would be horrible as well. So Kant uses a bit of philosophical prestidigitation, a little magic trick, to avoid granting the dog moral status. But he also wants people to be nice to dogs. So again, that's kind of a magic trick. So, because dogs lack rationality, according to Kant, they have no moral status. They're objects. He doesn't think they're like rocks or, sticks or etc. He's aware because he's dead, was aware that they're alive and, they seem to feel stuff. But from the standpoint of morality, they lack the rationality needed to be moral agents. So they have zero moral status, the same as rocks and sticks. But Kant holds that it would be wrong to abandon a loyal dog that has, served you well, but now is old and it's difficult to take care of. Why? Well, if a person abandoned, their loyal old dog, their humanity would be damaged by this callous and cruel action. Acting in inhumane ways towards animals, acting badly to animals, would harm the person. Now, it wouldn't harm the animal. I know that sounds weird that like shooting the dog wouldn't harm it, but for Kant, animals have no moral status. So yes, of course he'd agree they could be killed, etc., but they cannot be morally harmed because they have no moral status. So they can't be morally harmed. But humans have moral status. So if a person is mean to animals, this will lead to negative consequences towards humans who do have moral status. Why is this? Well, the way Kant reasons through this is that he contends that if a person treats animals cruelly, it would make them more likely to be cruel to other humans, to fail in their moral obligations to humans who have moral status, and this would be wrong. So for him, the treatment of animals can be seen as kind of moral practice for how we treat humans. And I use the analogy, this is not Kant's because it's this sort of thing takes place like long after Kant is dead, But it's analogous to the shoot, don't shoot police training. If you've seen this, it's often like a computer simulation where a person going through the training has to make a split-second decision to shoot or not shoot. Now, since it's just a computer simulation, a person engaging in it cannot wrong the simulations. They're just recordings. In most cases they're just film clips of actors. So there's no way that anybody can harm them. But if a person screws around in their shoot don't shoot training, then what's likely to happen? Well, what's likely to happen is that if their training is bad, when they go out into the actual world, they're more likely to shoot someone who they shouldn't shoot. And so even though the simulations and the training have no moral status because they're just film clips or computer generated images, how a person undergoes the training does matter because it has consequences for real people. So Kant tells us to be kind to animals because kindness to animals will develop our kindness to humans. So, roughly put, animals are objects of practice for the real thing, for humans. And this is what gives animals this Ersatz moral status. And again, Ersatz is not real moral status, but it's not a deception. It's not that it's trickery or deceit. It's kind of a virtual moral status. And so this argument given by Kant can justify an Ersatz moral status for artificial beings. And to illustrate this, I'll use the tragic tale of our good dead friend, Hitchbot. Froke, I'm probably mispronouncing it, Zeller, and David Smith created Hitchbot way back in the ancient days of 2015. Hitchbot, despite the name like Hitchbot, super kind of crude. I mean, cool idea, but it wasn't like a robot walking around, etc. It was just a iPhone with solar panels and a pretty cute anthropomorphic plastic shell, pictured here, and made to look, humanoid. Their intent was to conduct an experiment, determine how people would interact with the bot as it hitchhiked, hence its name Hitchbot, around the world. The bot made it safely across Canada, made it safely across Germany, but only lasted 2 weeks in the United States. It ended up being destroyed, ironically, in Philadelphia, the city of love. So this is why we can't have nice things, because that's how things go. So how does the destruction of Hitchbot, how does that connect to Kant? Well, here's how it goes. There is zero doubt about Hitchbot's moral status. It was entirely an object. As I said, it's just a iPhone hitched up to some solar panels and some plastic shell. I mean, it looked cute, etc. But it was totally an object. No one had any belief that it was anything more than just that. Now, what makes Hitchbot relevant? Hitbot's another thing. That's the assassin robot. That would do well in America. So what makes Hitchbot relevant is that people had positive feelings towards it. Why did they have this positive feeling? Well, one thing is, it's the same reason why people tend to have positive feelings for stuffed animals and toys. It had a very endearing appearance, and intentionally so. It was made to look, kind of childlike and harmless and friendly. Also, it had a virtual personality created on social media that the people running the experiment would tweet from its perspective. So it was the illusion of a person, a mechanical Turk hitching its way around the world. A mechanical Turk, of course, is a reference to the infamous Mechanical Turk, which is supposed to be a chess playing robot back centuries ago. But it was actually a person who was very good at chess who was controlling the mechanism. And the expression Mechanical Turk is a reference today, what it's used for is to refer to when it seems like a machine is, intelligent and is, or feeling or doing things, when behind the machinery is actually a person, controlling it. So given, given Kant, how Kant regards animals as objects, and Hitchbot as an object, it could be taken as morally equivalent to an animal. Now, the obvious objection, which probably sprung to mind immediately to you here, is this. This line of reasoning would seem to make all objects, such as rocks and sticks and tennis balls, on par with animals. Which for some people I guess would be fine, but seems kind of absurd. But Kant did not grant even Ersatz moral status to rocks or clocks. So this would be something that distinguishes animals from other objects. So Kant, in his Metaphysics of Ethics, he has a simple ontological dichotomy between rational beings and everything else. But he gives animals an Ersatz moral status. And this had to be grounded in something. So what was it grounded in? Well, it seems, looking at Kant's work, that it's grounded in the way humans treat animals has a psychological impact that influences how humans treat each other. So animals are more like humans than they are like rocks, and the similarity provides the foundation for their influence. This, of course, takes us to our good dead friend, Descartes. Descartes, while denying that animals have minds, and again for him, metaphysically, they would lack incorporeal minds, he doesn't deny that they have life or feelings. And Descartes reasoned that humans wrongly reason that animals have minds because of this analogical reasoning. And he believes the analogical reasoning is flawed. The animals seem like humans in appearance and actions. Premise 2, humans have minds. Conclusion, so animals have minds. And Descartes, for reasons that we saw, believes that this is mistaken reasoning. Basically that, although the analogy is appealing, it fails because of relevant differences between humans and animals that break the analogy. Now, our good dead friend Bertrand Russell, a famous philosopher, he was actually really famous. There's a chance you might have heard of him, although he was big in the 80s. He proposed a solution to the problem of their minds by, again, an argument by analogy. Essentially that, in my case, I think and feel, I see other beings similar to me, so I infer by analogy they think and feel too. So, getting back to the main point, the more an animal is like a human, the more a person becomes habituated to a particular way of treating such a being. And here we can steal from our good dead friend Aristotle. Aristotle, in his work on ethics, makes an excellent case for people becoming what they repeatedly do. Now, Plato claims, to steal from our good dead friend Plato, teacher of Aristotle, Plato in his discussion of art claims that people can be strongly influenced even by exposure to the emotions of fictional characters. So, we can contend that the same influence holds for artificial beings that are similar to animals that are like humans. For example, a robotic dog. But what about getting back to our good dead friend Hitchbot? Well, in the case of Hitchbot would be an illusory person. Hitchbot was an object that became an illusory person through social media and anthropomorphizing. The anthropart, man or human, pomorphizing form. It basically means to take something that's not human and sort of projecting our humanity onto it. And this was shown by the strong emotional response to Hitchbot's murder. So Hitchbot would be entitled to an Ersatz moral status because of its power to influence people emotionally. This would also apply to artificial beings that possess deeper similarities to animals or humans. So being more like animals and humans in relevant ways could yield an even greater psychological impact on humans, thus providing a stronger foundation for Ersatz moral status. So advanced artificial beings could engage in activities analogous to those humans engage in. And following Kant, if these activities were to create an obligation, if performed by a human, then they would also create an indirect obligation to artificial beings. So, we could use, the dog and robot examples. In the case of the dog, Kant says, even though the dog is not rational, it doesn't have moral status, it would be wrong to treat it badly. And the same with a robot dog. The same would hold as well, because if the robot dog could affect us as much as a dog could psychologically, it would be wrong for Kant to harm that dog, that robo-dog. Not because the robo-dog has any status, but because of the effect it would have on us. So what about human-like artificial beings? Well, even if their own moral status was in doubt, they would still be entitled to this Ersatz moral status. Their Ersatz moral status would make it wrong to harm or abuse artificial beings without adequate justification. And of course we allow this exception for natural beings, even natural human beings. Now, having only Ersatz moral status, they would be less morally protected than natural beings. And it would probably be the case that the needs of natural beings would trump such beings. So, on this view, artificial beings could be justifiably harmed if doing so was necessary to promote the ends of natural beings. Going back to our nuclear plant example, if Andy the android was strongly believed to have only Ersatz status, that you worked with Andy for years, but we're fairly confident that it just kind of feels like he thinks and feels, but maybe he doesn't really think or feel. Then if it comes down to who gets to go, die in the core, then it would of course have to be Andy. So, in conclusion, working out the moral status of artificial beings will be challenging, but can be done with proper guidance and reflection. And even if people are willing to grant such beings full moral status, to deny them metaphysical status needed to have this moral status, they would seem to be at least entitled to an Ersatz moral status, lacking the underlying metaphysical qualities for moral status, yet being such that they are entitled to this virtual moral status. Ersatz, as no old saying goes, is better than no moral status. So that takes us to the end of testing the moral status of artificial beings, so stay safe, and I will see you in the future.